Hey guys, this is Nate and this is the Nader Tater channel. Today I'm going to talk about the fastest cellular networks in the US, and this is a new test that was just done by an independent party. This isn't done by one of the carriers. It's not done by a coalition of the carriers for 5G or anything like that. This is done by PCMag, and so all of this data is from a recent article that they put up, and I really like how detailed it is and their methodology, where I think it is probably one of the better tests out there for real world use. And so what they did is they had the same phone. They traveled like 10,000 miles on a couple different routes, and I'll go through kind of a quick summary right now for like the little Cliff Notes version with a couple pictures, and then I will go into more detail later in the video of exactly what it means, because the fastest doesn't always mean it's going to be the best for you. There's some big caveats here, but the really unique thing about this year, if you look on the right side of the screen, every year that they've done this, so they started in 2010, it's been either AT&T or Verizon, and most notably it's been Verizon who's dominated this. But now for the first time, it's been T-Mobile that actually won, and I'll show you. It's not even like a slight edge. They actually have blown away AT&T, Verizon from seemingly out of nowhere. So that's really cool. I'll kind of go through that before. You might have seen some of my videos on T-Mobile Home Internet that I use, as well as their ultra capacity 5G, which is midband 5G, and I'll talk about that and how that's played a role in them coming out and really leading the space. So just a little bit of information about PCMag's test, and I'll put a link in the description below here on YouTube. But this is how they break it down and weight the different things. You might know that the FCC right now defines broadband as a download above 25 megabits per second and an upload above 3. And so there's all kind of government incentives going on right now and pushes to try to get broadband all across the U.S., and that's their definition of it. So it might be different than what you think of, a 1 gig symmetric fiber or something. That's not what they're calling broadband. But anyways, let's show you here. This blue lines, these are the routes that the testers from PCMag actually drove and went through these different cities and rural areas to test it. And what they did was they had a Samsung S21 phone, which is actually the phone my wife has, and they went through. They actually had multiple phones, and they had SIM cards from each carrier that were unlimited speed, and they would test them on 4G bands as well as 5G bands, and they would do each carrier separately, but at the same, within I think like a couple minutes of each other. And so the point there is, if you really know about cellular stuff, especially for a specific location, it can be affected by congestion. So that's where some of the tests, if you test in your home and you go drive or fly somewhere else in the country and test, it's not an apples to apples. So you really got to do it at the same time, same place, with the same device. And so that's what they did, and I think that's pretty neat. All right, so here is the history of the past 5 years, and what you'll see there is all of the carriers are improving. And for a little bit there, T-Mobile was lagging behind in 2020. This is because they're really making that big push, of completing the Sprint merger, doing all that, and then coming up with their new plan for 5G. The Sprint merger really gave them a lot of this mid-band frequency range, which they have now taken full advantage of. Well, I say full advantage of. They're in the process of taking full advantage of. They're still expanding out. So they're taking advantage of that, and now that has really given them this massive advantage for average download speed, and you'll see it in other places as well, over the other carriers, which really have kind of flatlined. And I think this has a lot to do with all the carriers tout 5G, but they're not touting the same thing. And this is what I kind of said before in my other coverage map about the mid-band 5G of T-Mobile. The difference is it's actually accessible and it's fairly widespread compared to like millimeter wave 5G, which T-Mobile has a little bit of, but that's really been the focus of Verizon. And what's really impressive is I actually had my uncle shared a screenshot. He was getting over 3 gigs per second download on millimeter wave 5G. I think that was at a sporting event or something, but that's what's really impressive about the millimeter wave. The problem is you can't get it at your house, pretty much. It's in really urban areas and it's tight, so it's not accessible. So that's not really helping their average download speed because they're testing in multiple different places. But AT&T, their 5G isn't really that good, and I'll show you their charts here that I think in some of their tests, PCMag actually shows their AT&T's 5G was slower than their 4G. So we'll go through some of that stuff in the next few minutes here. But here is the breakdown of kind of the summary, I guess, of the different metrics that they use to rate them. And you can see T-Mobile in the middle there, obviously with the win. And this is where I was talking about here for their maximum speed that they ever tested during this evaluation. T-Mobile did not win. It was Verizon that won at that 2.2 megabits per second download. But when you look at the average, that's where they're really outperforming. So upload is another place that T-Mobile is really beating the competition a lot. For both maximum and average, they are a complete different level than both AT&T, Verizon in second and third place. If you look at lag or latency, they're about equal. T-Mobile's a little bit behind there. Verizon's a little bit better than the other ones. And then network availability, Verizon and AT&T are both tied there, but then T-Mobile is down. And that I will say that T-Mobile definitely has some spots that they are missing. I've noticed that in rural parts of Michigan, where I would have signal on my Verizon phone, the wife would not have it on T-Mobile. So that's something you have to look into, and we'll talk about coverage maps here in a second as well. So if we look at 5G versus 4G, which I thought this was a really neat thing they did. Now, PCMag has it for their different routes, their east route, their central route, and west route. Since I'm in Michigan, I clicked on the central one to speak to it. But if you look at this in magenta is that T-Mobile, and what this chart shows, if you're right in this middle line, this 0 line, that means that the 5G, when they switch the bands to 5G, the phone is no faster than on the 4G band if it was right at 0, which basically none of these are. That Austin, Texas AT&T is about the closest one to it. But if you look at, for most of these, other than where Houston and Dallas, Verizon has that massive, that's about 300 to 350% faster on 5G than 4G. Other than those couple locations that Verizon has that strong 5G and perhaps that millimeter wave, if it's not that, then T-Mobile is really the only one that shows a consistent massive improvement on 5G versus a 4G signal. And so that's where they're really gaining, and that's what I've noticed. That's where the T-Mobile home internet, you're able to lock onto that, and you can get true broadband or more like cable type speed that you would expect for home ISP. But this is where, when you look at AT&T and even Verizon in Austin, for example, their 5G is almost worthless, right? I mean, their best one in the central zone is about a 40% improvement, which I guess that's nothing to balk at, but it's not revolutionary like the T-Mobile speeds and Verizon speeds. And then in several of these places, the AT&T 5G was less fast. It looks like 5-10% less fast, and that might, I could even chalk that up to variation over several minutes. But anyways, the point is, I wouldn't call AT&T of having a legitimate 5G network. Okay, and so talking about the 5G of T-Mobile specifically in this midband that we're talking about, what does the midband mean? To simplify it down, there's like low band, midband, and high band. And the low band is think of it as the older traditional 3G, 4G signals out there that have a lower frequency, which allows the signal to travel further, as well as penetrate through trees and buildings and other objects. Basically, the length of the wavelength enables it to pass through objects better, and therefore one tower can cover several miles of area and get maybe slower speed, but it's more consistent over a wide area. And then as you go higher frequencies, you go all the way to the other extreme, the high band or high frequency range, like the millimeter wave stuff. The millimeter wave means that I guess the wavelength is really tight together. That's a high frequency, and that stuff has a harder time penetrating through objects, and therefore you have to have lots of these little microcells to spread that signal out. But the midband is kind of this Goldilocks zone where they're able to still get good coverage. You don't have as much maximum speed that you can get with the millimeter, but you have a lot more bandwidth capacity than you do in the low band range. And so T-Mobile had dominated buying. The way it works is FCC basically licenses out or sells these bandwidth segments to specific carriers, and they're the only carrier that can use it. So T-Mobile has that, and that's what this talks about here is T-Mobile going through and getting over really the last year or so a lot of these areas rolled out, and now they're saying that they have 165 million people have access to their 5G network. And then this is obviously showing that PCMag has found that that's true. Now, as we saw from the map, they didn't cover every state, they didn't cover every area, and that's because it's impossible to do. The FCC is trying to do that. Actually, they're trying to collect all that data, but it's coming from the carriers. The carriers have to self-report it, and it's not a guy standing there and testing the data. It's their own. I guess you call it estimation of what type of speed. But so let's go actually to their article here that you can read. I'm not going to read it to you guys, but just to go into a little bit more detail of what they're doing and why they're doing it, and talk about, I'll show you real fast here some of the other areas, the east route that they showed. Again, it's a very similar story where T-Mobile was the most consistent. I thought it was kind of neat. I actually grew up around Atlanta. That they're all kind of tied at the same improvement with their 5G versus their 4G. But again, the AT&T is the one that really sticks out as being the worst 5G network, at least from a speed standpoint. And we'll talk about reliability and coverage maybe in a bit, because that's obviously another important factor to have. So again, on the west coast, it's the same story, right? So you can look through that stuff if you guys are truly interested in it. But we talked about the other companies kind of flatlined. I basically stole a lot of these pictures just from there to put it in a PowerPoint, so it's easier to talk to. So this is talking about availability, and this is really something that T-Mobile is working on. They certainly don't have the biggest network. I think biggest is AT&T's claim. Verizon is the most reliable network or something. But so T-Mobile, in some areas they have really good. Let's see, this second to last bar is 90%. Reliability or availability in these Chicago, Tucson, Las Vegas, New York, Boston, Miami type areas. But then in other places, if the key thing you'll see consistent here is a lot of rural areas are the ones that are really hurting for getting access to that 5G network, which means you're not going to benefit from all that extra capability that we showed in the previous charts that T-Mobile delivers, which is really you need their 5G signal to to make that happen. So that's where in some rural areas you might not get the best speed from T-Mobile, even though they won this competition, because AT&T or Verizon might have better signal quality or more towers to detect. So speaking of that, there are some other things that they point out which are valid, and that is that T-Mobile maybe has the bandwidth, or the spectrum to run these 5G, but their backhaul isn't as built up as AT&T and Verizon. So these towers have fiber, or most of the time they have fiber. Some of the older ones might have copper or even microwave technology to get it back to the hub. But to get access to the internet, they had to have a backhaul. So as T-Mobile or any of these carriers kind of get more people on there, their congestion might happen on that fiber line, and that's where T-Mobile is probably struggling a little bit more than the others, and that's something else that they're building out. And I know actually in my talks to T-Mobile tech support, that's one of the things they've actually mentioned, is that I forget what they called it, but they're upgrading. I forget if they're calling the base signal, but they almost openly admitted that they're doing some backhaul improvements. And once that happens, this whole area might improve as well. So that was kind of interesting that PCMag actually brought that up, and as well as I had heard that directly from T-Mobile tech support. So the other thing is, if you look at the average download speeds, it ranges. So we go to the 5G cities here. This is showing you that this is where T-Mobile, these are the different bins. So, not all of them were super fast and not all of them were super slow. You have a range of them depending on where you're at. And this is where you can see for all of this, 200 megabits per second all the way up to the 600 that they tested here. T-Mobile has a clear lead over AT&T, Verizon, that had very few speed tests at that speed. And then at the lower speed, we're talking about 30 megabits, 60 megabits per second. That's where T-Mobile had the fewest test results of that, and the other ones had the most. So that's for 5G. If you switch it though to all tests, so that includes the 4G stuff, that's where you can see some of these places where T-Mobile has more slow tests. So if you were a user at that location, you would be slower with a T-Mobile phone than an AT&T phone, for example, here, and at this really low speed one, which is, they mark it at 0, so I think that means it must be from 0 to 30 megabits per second. So that's something to note, is that there are some weak areas of the T-Mobile network where you either have slow speed or no signal, whereas at the same location with a Verizon phone or AT&T phone, you would have signal and you would have faster speed. Okay, and then so, touching a little bit more on that coverage map, I mentioned that the FCC does have a now consolidated map. They're trying to show coverage for each carrier, and in this article they break it down with the FCC map in the middle, and then the PCMag test location. So they're driving down this interstate or highway here, and these little dots illustrate places that they had signal and with which carrier they had it with, and then they show the actual carrier provided map, like the T-Mobile map here. And what you'll see is that typically the carrier's map is the most optimistic, which perhaps isn't very surprising. They're very motivated to try to say that they have better coverage than you might get, or to be fair with them, they aren't going out there and testing. They use algorithms based off of the terrain and the cell that they're using to come up with these maps. But FCC processing of their data seems to be more realistic, at least according to what PCMag is saying they saw in their testing this year. And so, the other thing that they say is, they see midband as the future, and that's what I've kind of said all along. It seems to me to be kind of the Goldilocks, and that's where there's going to be lots of competition now. Now, AT&T and Verizon did start to buy up some more of that spectrum, but they can't use it until 2022 at least. So they have at least another 4 months before they can even take advantage of that and try to compete with T-Mobile in this space. But so you can go to their article and check it out. You can obviously comment on their article and talk to them as well. But if you have any questions or comments, what you tested yourself or seen in your area, especially if it's not an area that they tested, feel free to comment in the video comment section below, and I'll be sure to reply. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned.